Good morning and welcome to a ACT Junior Chess League summary of and coverage of an online event which we were running yesterday. My name is Sean Press. I'm producing this on behalf of the ACT Junior Chess League here in Canberra, Australia. It has been a while since I've done one of these. We had a break over Christmas, but the Junior Chess League has started running some online events for our junior players over the summer holidays here in Australia. And we ran one yesterday. And I've picked a nice game to look at today, which covers some interesting stuff and some good tactics as well. So hopefully there'll be enough interesting and important moves in here that you can pick up some tips and strategies from. So let's get started. The game is played between two of our junior players. Just refer to them by their online handles, Dev Rashura and Wooly Archer 716. And the ratings there, 1878 and 1539 are Lee Chess ratings. They're rated a little bit below that, but they're both very talented players here in the ACT. Excuse me. So off we go. E4, C6. So Caro-Kann, D4, D5. E takes D5, C takes. So the exchange variation of the Caro-Kann, not necessarily a bad choice. And in fact, the follow-up from white is a well thought out one. So C4, and this is the Panov Botvinnik attack, which is a nice way of meeting it. There's a couple of interesting thoughts here. I'm just going to look at the very first idea, which is, why don't we just take the pawn? We leave white with an isolated queen pawn, which can be a good or bad thing. So white takes with the bishop all in one go, knight c6 and knight f3. And I'll get to the second move first. E6 is actually needs to be played by black normally, and it's not a bad move. White has the isolated d pawn, of course, but a slight lead in development, a little bit more space, and freedom to bring the other pieces out means that actually white shouldn't be too worried about this position. After knight f3, the move that is a blunder is bishop g4. Even though it looks like a simple move, you're simply threatening to take the bishop, the knight on f3 with the queen, and then capture the d pawn, which will not be protected any longer. But this blows up in one of two ways. White can play the classic bishop takes f7 move here. For those that haven't seen it before, the idea behind this is to force the king to come to f7, and then you just throw your knight to g5, as long as the knight can't be captured. And then when the king retreats, you pick up the bishop. So even though the knight doesn't move normally, because the bishop will take the queen on d1, if you can play this move safely with check, and the bishop isn't protected on g4, it's going to fall victim to the queen. And sure, black will take the pawn here to keep even pawns, but even after queen here, white is generally pretty happy with their position. It's important to note that black can't castle now in this position because black has moved the king. Once I played a game where I did take on f7 and moved back to f8 and then tried to castle, and was politely told by my opponent that this was illegal. So the stronger move, though, it turns out, is not to immediately take on f7. It's to play d5 to drive the knight away from c6, because if the knight moves somewhere like e5, then there's a nice sacrifice here. You just take the knight. Because sure, the bishop will take the queen, but if you look more than one move ahead, you'll realize that bishop b5 check. And how does the king get out of check? It can't move, can't take the bishop. So the only move is to put the queen in the road, and you take the queen. So even now, if you just count the pieces, you'll realize that white is an extra piece ahead. And after king takes d8, we take on f7, forking king and rook on h8. And after the king takes, then we just don't take the rook straight away, because the rook can't escape. We take the bishop. Okay, and then white is still a piece and a pawn ahead, and is going to take the rook anyway, and it's going to be a rook, a piece, and a pawn ahead. So, and that's an utter catastrophe for black. I did say there was lots of tactics in here, but these aren't necessarily hard tactics. They're usually checks and captures, which are always the tactics we want to look for. Even if black doesn't move the knight to e5, but takes on f3 instead, which is the other way of playing it. Queen takes f3. You play knight d4 because you don't, again, want to walk into that problem of the bishop going to b5 with check. In this case, the knight protects, but after the queen goes to d3, the knight can't move at the moment. No safe squares for the knight. So we play e5 to protect it. But after castles here, white's got a nice position. Not a winning position in this case, but certainly a pretty good position. So that's what can go wrong if you think you're pinning with bishop g4. So instead, knight moved to f6. Knight goes to c3 in this case, so we're not capturing. Now, when I was first learning chess, there was an incredibly popular book called Attacking Openings for the Club Player, if I've got the title right, by Raymond Keane and David Levy. And club players swore by this. And it gave this line as an antidote to the Caro-Kann. This is Gundurum's attack, as it's known. And the idea is that you push the pawn to c5, and then the goal is to start pushing these queenside pawns. And you push the b pawn safely if you can, you push the a pawn, you play the pawn to b5, you drive the knight away, and then you play c6, and eventually what you do is you create a passed pawn. And you may think that that's an idea that might not work, but I've seen a couple of players, Justin Marshall, who was a very strong junior and former ACT junior chess champion, play it very successfully. The only drawback with it is after something like knight c6, a well-timed e5 tends to do the biz. Okay, unfortunately, you break up white's centre before white gets the queenside rolling. But nonetheless, you might want to have a look at that. So instead, knight c3, knight c6, bishop e6 has been played in this position, by the way, before, if I can remember correctly. Knight to f3, bishop to g4 now. That whole fancy-smancy tactic of winning the queen doesn't quite work in this position. Or the opposite, trying to play knight e5 and sacrificing your queen. Funnily enough, having just said that c5 isn't considered that great, when I was looking at this, c5 was one of the moves that was then suggested by the engine. Push in the middle. Again, as I said, this is the way to fight back. And even in this position, if we take, knight takes, queen e2 in this case to pin down the e-file is actually a much stronger move. The knight retreats, the other knight obviously, retreats to protect. And we're just starting to pile up here on the knight because the knight can't move because of the check. One of the strategies for dealing with pinned pieces, of course, is you just simply attack them. So, f6, castles. You can play bishop takes f3 here because obviously queen takes f3 doesn't work because there's no pin anymore, and you can just take the knight, take the queen. But bishop takes e5, rook takes d5. And in this case, white is slightly better. They've got more development. Basically, black still needs to castle. There's a whole lesson to be had on attacking the opponent's king if it's stuck in the center, but that's for another day. Instead, c took, knight takes, queen b3. I did like this move. Unfortunately, there's a small flaw in it, but I did actually like this move because double attack, attacking the knight and attacking the pawn on b7. The slight flaw was that black can actually play bishop takes f3 because it actually defends the knight for the moment. And when you play g takes f3, e6 again, defending the knight. If you play queen takes b7 down here, knight takes d4 is quite a strong idea for black. You're threatening knight c2, check, winning the rook in the corner. You're playing knight, threatening knight takes f3, winning a pawn. And so white has bitten off slightly more than they should chew. Luckily for white, black played knight to b6. d5, okay, let's take some space in the center. Let's try and push the knights around. Black took on f3 first. Nice intermediate move. It's worth noting that if you take here, the bishop's going to come back here and you've actually managed to lose yourself a pawn, which is probably not what you're aiming for in this sequence of moves. So we take, and it's a bit ugly, the pawn structure. And black played knight e5. Knight d4 was stronger because, again, this b5, this bishop b5 check is really annoying. And so the more you can do to prevent that, the better off you are. So bishop here, knight goes back. You can take, by the way, but then that just means that that lovely posted knight on d4 is not doing anything any longer. The knight goes to d7. And if you retreat the queen back here to protect the f3 pawn and the c2 square at the same time, knight takes now, queen a5 check. knight back to c3. These moves are forced because you don't want to get your knight captured. And then rook d8. And this position is considered equal. Materials equal. The pawn on d5 is annoying because if you play e6, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. So getting that bishop off f8 into the game is important and slightly hard to do. But at the same time, yeah, I think black has overcome the worst of it here. So in positions like this, you often, especially at junior chess, there's a lot of flurry of take. But then once the smoke clears, there's often problems still to be solved. In this case, black still needs to develop their pieces, while white doesn't look like they've got a really safe place to put their king. Instead, the knight went to e5, which allowed the check, and the knight isn't threatening to take the bishop. Knight bd7 might have been better to keep the pawn on f3 a target, because the knight went back this way. So now white is a little bit happier because they don't have to worry about losing the f3 pawn. Knight goes to e4. It's a good move, especially after black played g6. This was probably where it all just went badly wrong. And at first it looks pretty innocuous. g6, and we're going to put the bishop on g7. And then we're going to castle, and then we've got nothing to complain about. Okay? Because one of the lessons from this game is if you leave your king in the center for too long, bad things can happen. One of the lessons that is being ignored in this game is white's done exactly the same thing and doesn't seem to be punished for it. d6 is an excellent attacking move here. Okay? Because the main problem now is, and this is combined with the problem with g6, is when we take here, bishop g5 attacks the queen. If you make the obvious blocking move with bishop to e7, knight takes d6 just now wins, because the bishop takes the knight, you just take the queen. Worse is if you play king f8, because then you just get checkmated with queen takes f7. So because of g6, the position started to fall apart. If the pawn was still on g7, knight to f6 or d6 doesn't work because we just capture. And if the bishop goes to g5, we can block with f6. So after d6, black didn't take, obviously realised something had gone badly wrong here. Played pawn to e6, but the same bishop to g5 move just lands on the board. Attacking the queen. Now we can't block because the pawn will take. f6 doesn't work because the knight on d7 is pinned by the bishop on b5. So even though this might look like it's blocking it, we can just take, because this knight on this square here can't move. Sorry, wrong button. So if I wave this around a bit, it can't move because you'll realise you're in check down here. So the queen went to c8, okay, and then knight f6 was enough for black to resign. But I'll give you a nice example line of why black should have resigned in this position. Check, king only has one square now. King has to go to d8, and then we get this nice take the knight, and the bishop on g5 is now attacking the king. Now, there are a lot of moves that can be played, all of which lose. I'll just pick one. King goes back to e8. Okay. Then the knight takes on b6 with the discovered check by the bishop on b5. Queen goes to c6 because it's the only way to block the check. You can block on c7 as d7 as well, but with the same result. And then after bishop takes, pawn takes. And the reason I chose this line is because of this next move. Pawn to d7, checkmate. Very rare to get a checkmate just by moving a pawn up the board, but this is what white could have done if black had decided to drag the position out. So a couple of lessons from this game. One, leave your king in the center. Bad things can happen to it. Castle early, castle often, as I always say. Two, know your opening theory. I'm sure white deliberately chose this opening, not because he was making it up on the spot, but because he'd had a look at what to do against the Caro-Kann and decided this was not bad. Three, probably the most important from here is white, I think, felt they had an advantage, but rather than waste the advantage with nothing moves, like they use that advantage to create a big advantage. d5 especially is a really good move in this position to drive the knight away and then open up for checks against the king. So that was played in yesterday's online tournament organised by the ACT Junior Chess League. We're looking at running a few of those each week coming up. And the other big thing that we're doing is we're going to be organising some online training. We were going to do face-to-face training, but numbers are pretty low because people are a bit skittish about getting out into crowded places. So we're going to look at doing that online in a couple of weeks. So if you're here in Canberra, you're a member of the ACT Junior Chess League, hopefully you'll be able to sign up for that shortly. So as I said at the top, my name is Sean Press. I produced this summary on behalf of the ACT Junior Chess League, and I'll probably do one for whatever tournaments that we're running over the holidays. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll be seeing you later.